to Rat Hack Shop, home of Hello Shitty Racing. My name is Philip. I'm one of the people behind Hello Shitty Racing. And a lot of people in the recent days, as we're stuck at home due to coronavirus, have posted some really cool walkarounds of their Lemons cars. And so I thought we could do the same thing for one of our latest builds, this 1984 Bitter SC. Hello Shitty Racing has been around for a bunch of years, and we started with some pretty conventional stuff, two E30s, BMW E30s, and then kind of graduated into the kookier things, I would say. And we've done a Subaru-powered Super Beetle that had dual controls. We did a TDI-powered Porsche 911, a Bricklin SV1, a Willys Aerolarg, and then this I guess was the latest build. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this car. So I guess like some of you might ask themselves, what actually is a bitter? And that is a totally valid question. And ultimately, I think we should tell the story of Bitter Cars as a company and the man behind it and kind of the cars behind this company in a follow-up video, because it is such a kooky and goofy story and full of aspiration and failure and bankruptcy and divorce and I mean, like, it's so much like other Lemon stories that we really ought to do this. And even though I'm probably not as good of a storyteller as Jay Lamb or John Ficarra, I think it well deserves a follow-up video. For now, let's just talk a little bit about this car. So it is a 1984 Bitter SC. They made about 461 of these cars, and the exact number is actually not well known. Why? Because so Bitter was a coach builder, and they hand built cars, and so there weren't really very good records about how many prototypes were built and were they counted and did they get VINs and so on and so forth. It was all a little bit loosey-goosey at the time. What Bitter did, what their playbook was, is they took Opel components and basically an Opel floor pan and driveline and suspension, and built their own bodies on top. And they were typically these bodies. They were supposed to look very Italian and luxurious. And it started with the Bitter CD, and then this is their second model, which was also officially sold in the US. And then they tried a few more times after that, and it never really worked. So they used Opel, which is German GM, European GM, well, now part of the PSA group, but for many decades it was part of GM. That doesn't really mean that it has anything to do with an American GM car. There's about 2 or 3 components that you might find on an American GM car in this car. The car is actually a lot more like a European car, a German car of the time. So underneath this body is an Opel Senator, floor pan, suspension, motor, driveline, the whole lot. Opel Senator or Opel Monza. Monza was the coupe of the Senator, fastback coupe. And so basically the Senator, it was designed, Senator and Monza, they were designed in the late 70s. And so this basically has like late 70s German car stuff on it that you would find on the equivalent, the first BMW 5 Series, the E12, the E24, the 6 Series, or a contemporary Mercedes like a W108 or whatever it would have been. And in fact, a lot of the components are very similar. It has ATE brakes, it has Bosch fuel injection, and the suspension is incredibly similar to like a BMW E12. If you look at the diagram, it has rear semi-trailing arms. In general, it is just simply very similar to a German car of the time. So at the time I got this about 2 years ago. I found this on Facebook Marketplace, and at the time I was kind of tinkering with Bitter's personally, and actually didn't really have any interest in racing one. I was actually kind of like not racing anymore at all. And then I saw this pop up on Facebook Marketplace, and I originally thought of it as a parts donor. And so I bought this from the previous owner, who was, I believe, a nurse, and she, I think, a retired nurse. And the car had been sitting in her front yard for 10 years. And it was probably parked there because something on it broke. And because it is a bitter, which nobody knows around here, which is based on an opal, which some people know around here, and there are like 2 or 3 people in the US that actually do understand about opals and do have the parts. But ultimately, it was probably parked because nobody knew how to work on it, and or to fix it was just going to be an ordeal. And that's what happens with these really rare cars. Sometimes you can just pick them up because they don't find any love. And probably at some point it must have belonged to somebody a little higher up in the food chain, I suppose, because there was a snazzy 1990s style car phone mounted that was fantastic. But as it happens so often, is that like when these people they'll buy something exotic and they'll drive it for a few years, and that's really fun for them. But then they'll move on to the next exotic, kooky thing, especially if something breaks. And then a car like this ends up at a used car dealership, and in this case, it was in the middle of nowhere in Illinois. And then somebody who might treat themselves to something like this buys it, not really knowing what kind of nightmare they might be getting themselves into. And this is actually kind of the plot of an episode of the Goldbergs, in which actually, like, what happened. This actually happened to Adam Goldberg's family. The dad wanted to treat himself to a fun car, and he bought a bitter, and of course it ended up in total disaster. So this car, when it arrived, there were certainly tons of really good parts on it that we knew we could use. But the body is just, as you can kind of see, it has a lot of rot, and just something that you wouldn't really be able to economically repair and restore. It's not really like a Porsche 356 or something, or a Ferrari or something like that, where it really pays to go through the body work and really do it. It would be thousands of hours of welding and metal fabrication. But apart from the body, which really, again, didn't make sense to restore, all of mechanically was actually in really good shape. And that's really when kind of the penny dropped for us, and we were like, man, we have to race this. I mean, do we have a choice? We could actually build the first bitter race car in the world, which not only is that's kind of cool by itself, but also Eric Bitter, the founder of the company, he was a race car driver himself, and there was never actually any of his cars that he built were actually ever raced, and we thought that was actually a great tragedy, and so we were quite happy to correct that mishap of history, really. So we set to build it as a race car, and ended up competing with it at Sonoma. Why don't we take a look at some of the details, and we'll take a look. All right. Here is the engine bay of the Bitter. The first thing you'll notice is this big hunk of iron, which is an Opal straight 6. It doesn't really share any parts with anything that was ever made in America. So even though it might say GM on here and a few other castings, that really has no bearings on anything. You won't be able to find any parts for this thing in an AutoZone. It's a straight 6. People who have seen the engine bay of, say, an Opel GT or any other Opels that did make it to America from the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, may recognize this engine as essentially 150% of the 4-cylinder CIH motor, cam-in head motor, that was in those smaller cars, and that's exactly what it is. It's the cam-in head 6-cylinder motor. So what's nice about that is that essentially everything that's on the front of the motor, all the gaskets, the timing covers, the water pump, and all that stuff, we can just go to some of the few places here in the US that supply the parts for the Opel GT community really well, and that's great. For anything that's kind of like alongside of the motor, that's really hard, and we've had to bring things like gaskets and things like that back from Germany in suitcases. And had to, in fact, pack suitcases that were large enough to fit, a straight six head gasket and other kinds of gaskets on the side. The other thing you might notice is that this is actually a reverse flow motor. In many ways, this car, as I mentioned, is very similar to, say, a BMW of the late 70s. But this was really where Opel, GM of Europe, was showing its age in kind of just using something that was really outdated. It's not really a true overhead cam motor. There are small push rods in there that the cam's kind of like sits pretty low in the head or to the side. It's a reverse flow head. The entire motor is cast iron. And BMW was already miles ahead in terms of the engine department at the time in the late 70s. The fuel injection system, people might recognize this. This is a standard Bosch Algetronic airflow meter, and the injectors are matching that. So the injectors and this airflow meter, as well as the ECU and the fuel pump, are all exactly the same as at in a say contemporary BMW 5 or 6 series, the E12 and the E24. We have made a few improvements to this car in the engine bay. So one of the things that tends to break German plastic, and so the coolant bottle that was here, we really didn't want to trust it, and they are also no longer available, like so many parts, even though Opel is still around. And unlike Porsche and Mercedes and BMW, who will still make parts when they go NLA, Opel really doesn't. And that can sometimes be really tricky, especially if you're trying to restore a car to the original factory specification. We don't really care in Lemons, so what we did is we had this Passat or Audi A4 bottle on the shelf, and we just built some brackets for it, job done. And the other thing that we really wanted to improve is cooling. And so one of our team members had this Datsun 240Z, really snazzy 2 or 3 inch core aluminum radiator on the shelf. It fit after some banging and bashing of the bracketry. It fit in here almost perfectly. We had to relocate one of the inlets, or rather the bottom outlet. But since it's an aluminum radiator, that's very easily done with a TIG welder, and then it fit in here pretty well. I had to make a custom mount, of course, and those things. But this has done a really incredibly good job in keeping the motor cool. So we're pretty happy with that. The other improvement that we made is we always like to have gauges and early warnings. And so we use Race Capture, Autosport Labs Race Capture on this car, and we have our gauge senders up there that are plumbed into the fuel rail and are plumbed into the oil pressure system, and they provide us with the telemetry that we really need in order to diagnose any problems with the engine. There are just a few parts that might be familiar to American viewers, or people who are familiar with American cars, American GM cars on this car. One of them is the power steering pump. That, in fact, the power steering pump and the steering column are Saginaw products, and so this one would have probably been found on like a Corvette or Camaro at the time. The Bricklin that we had, which had an AMC motor, had something very similar. I'm pretty sure they just shopped for the same GM parts at Saginaw at the time. Before we completely move on from the engine bay, you may have noticed that the car has pop-up headlights. It doesn't really have them any longer. There are no more headlights, and they don't pop. We have now fixed these permanently. Originally, what would have been here in this hole would have been a Porsche 914 headlight motor. That's what they used. Again, they just used off-the-shelf German part stuff just for the ease of being able to pick things off the shelf. But we're now routing our oil cooler lines down on this side, and similar over here. There's some piping going through here. We have the transmission cooler on the driver's side. These are other improvements that we made. One of the things that you really want to do is keep your motor and your tranny happy. And so here we see the tranny cooler, and we have the exact same components on the other side, the oil cooler. Those are the biggest units that we were able to fit in these holes and keep our engine and our tranny happy. Next, we'll have a look at the interior of the bidder. Now, as you do with any kind of Lemons car, you strip most of it out, and we really stripped everything because we ended up selling it and actually made all of the purchase price back by selling the really fancy leather interior that was in here. And it all went to good use. It helped a car to be fully restored to its old glory again. So sometimes even when you make a Lemons car, there's a good story behind it, and it ends up benefiting the rest of the car community, the car collector community. So yeah, we stripped the interior, and then what I like to do is I like to paint everything white. It really helps you kind of notice when you have things rubbing somewhere, when you drop something, when you have a leak or something. And another thing that we have found works really well is actually this skateboard grip tape here. That really helps you get in and out. It does wear off quite quickly, but it's very cheap, and you can just reapply it. It helps you kind of get in and out of the car, and it helps you from sliding about, because otherwise the white surface would be really slippery, and especially when it's raining, which it always does at Sonoma. That's really handy. Yeah, you might notice actually that there's no seat or belts in there right now. That's what we do. We pull them after every race because the car actually normally lives outside, and there are cats and other mice and badgers and whatever other animals out there, and we don't really want them eating our foam and pooping into the seat and all that stuff. Let's have a little look at kind of the cockpit. And so first of all, I did mention the Saginaw column, and it actually has the height adjustability, which is very Saginaw. And then the rest of the dash is totally custom. This is what a team member of ours made for this car, and it turned out really well. He's the same guy who supplied the Datsun radiator, so it's not a surprise that he ended up using Datsun I think 510 sight marker lights as these big warning lights. That's actually a recommendation that came from Judge Phil Graydon, who always said, like, you really need the biggest idiot lights that you can think of. And honestly, these work so really well. There's some LED bulbs in here, I think, and they just go straight to these switches in the motor. And so there isn't any connection to the telemetry system. So they're totally independent warning lights, and that's something that we like to have. Here you see the tablet. That's just an Android tablet that another team member had, and it's running the Autosport Labs software, and it's all connected to the down here to this race capture system. I have to say, this is really just the cheapest and best and most reliable way to do gauges these days. Not to buy individual gauge senders and then hook them up to and then you have to build a whole dash or something. No, this is just Velcroed tablet. You can pick these up for so cheap anywhere these days. This was a few years old. It doesn't matter. And honestly, spend your money on the race capture system is my personal recommendation, and these guys are great. They're Lemons racers too. Yeah, and so then we have a little bit of switch gear here. That's really just the minimum amount just for ignition, and we always like to have a manual switch for the fuel pump. And in fact, like, this is a 3-way switch. You can turn it off, you can turn it perma on, or you just have it switch to the normal ignition cycle. And that's so that you can purge the tank if you need to, or if you have the car running, you just turn the fuel pump off and it depressurizes the system.
And that's something that we like to do. You know, if you need to do any kind of diagnostic on the motor and you need to open a fuel line, you don't want gasoline spraying in your face. And then we have a manual switch for the fan. We don't really bother with kind of any automation. The fan's always on when you're racing. Another thing that we've learned over time, these marine style fuse box holders are really, really useful, and they really clean up your wiring very nicely. And so that worked really well. The entire wiring harness is, we started from scratch. That's another thing that I find, especially with these old cars that have been hacked up and changed, and 90% of the stuff and the wiring we didn't really need. So we just started from scratch, including the engine harness. It just ends up being more reliable that way. You know exactly what you're getting. Then the rest of it is really the standard sort of Lemons safety stuff. We have the fire suppression system, which is this bottle right here. We relocated the battery to inside the interior, just because we had kind of put a coolant bottle in its place where it would normally go, and it's kind of really crowded already in the engine bay, so we didn't really care for that. And otherwise, we just love how much space there is. It is a big coupe, and this is after like racing a Bug and a 911 and a Bricklin, and that are so cramped on the inside. It's so nice to have a car that can carry its own spares when needed, can carry its own spare tires. There's just a ton of space. I think that's about it for the interior. One last thing that I can talk about here is the string system. This is something that we've had in several of our cars that I can really highly recommend building something like this. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but this is basically a 64-ounce Gatorade bottle. We just happened to pick that size because it fits really nicely into this, I think, 4-inch drain pipe or whatever it is. That's just simply zip tied to the roll cage here. And then what you do is you put a Camelback straw and then a Camelback a tube, a replacement tube, which you can buy at any REI or Amazon or anywhere, and a bite valve. And then when the driver sits in here, we just sort of feed it up through the holes in the seat along with the harness, and the driver can sort of just pick up the tube from his or her chest and have a sip of water. And every driver in our team has a separate bottle, and when we do the driver change, we just yank on this, yank the bottle out, and everybody gets their own drink. And otherwise, this is in here pretty secure because of this little wire. I'm sure folks can come up with their own solution, but this has really worked very well, and being hydrated on track has sometimes just made all the difference in the world. Okay, I've pulled the car on the lift so we can take a look at some of the mechanical components. Yeah, here we see it's a pretty typical for the time. The disc brake bolts to the back of the hub. It's really annoying, but the 911 did it like that, and a bunch of other cars. This is our ATE brake caliper. What's really nice is, again, like a lot of the cars of the time, this is not a sliding affair, but you can actually like pull the brake pads out just like that without any kind of tools other than a hammer and something to drive these pins out. We run Ray Besto's ST43s on many of our cars. I have to say they're really a really good compound for endurance racing. The pad size is actually the same front and back as a Porsche 911 SC, which is really handy because we had one of those. We raced one of those, so we actually had some spare brake pads on the shelf. Talk about luck. So that was really cool. Again, that's where it comes in handy that this is kind of just a German car. You may notice we replaced these brake lines, and that's really a theme that when we build a car, or when I like to build a car, is I really like to go through anything that can fail. I don't really like leaving things up to chance on the track. And so when it's been sitting for 10 or more years and has questionable history, I just go through all the rubber parts. For sure, the entire fuel system gets rebuilt. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I also go through the suspension. So this thing has new ball joints that we pressed in and that we had to bring in from Germany. And we have new suspension bushings as well. And then, of course, we rebuilt the entire brake system. So we took these calipers. We didn't split them, but they got new seals and new boots. And then we have new brake lines as well. And that's just something we just do on any old car like that, whether it's a Bricklin or a Bitter or a Beetle. So we're working on the Bitter calipers from the parts car today. They were badly seized, the pistons, and doing compressed air just wouldn't work. So what we have here is the caliper. We're holding one piston in right now. We have a Vanagon brake hose, Vanagon brake line, the 944 brake hose, a Datsun 510 clutch master cylinder mounted to a 911 pedal box. That'll give us some nice leverage. And so what I'm going to do is now, I have one piston halfway out already, and I'm just going to use this to push out the other one. So here we go. And this like super badly seized piston is, and now I have to refill some fluid because this reservoir is tiny. And here we go, just super easy.
Oh, it's smooth.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And then we'll switch it around in a sec and do the other one. Cool. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Everything is better with heat. And then the other thing you might notice here is the strut and the spring. And this is basically very similar to, say, a BMW. I was talking about that at the time. When we got this car, we lightened it tremendously, and so the springs that were in here would have just made it ride incredibly high, and they were also just simply not up to the task. They were not stiff enough. We tried to measure kind of like what their spring rate was, which in like a very lemony way.
So we've tried to research Bitter spring rates on the internet and failed. So we've devised a spring rate measurement apparatus. So this former kitchen scale, has been calibrated to be at 0 pounds with all of the static elements on
Wait,
here.
you weigh your rice with that scale?
Sorry?
You weigh rice or flour with that scale?
Oh, sorry, not kitchen. It's a body scale.
Bathroom.
Bathroom scale? Well, do you
Yes.
weigh a bathroom with it?
So many bathrooms.
So we're gonna try and compress the spring by 1 inch and read what the scale measures.
But what we ended up with is just some eBay springs that we had left over from some other cars that probably were from some coilover kit for a Honda Civic or whatever, like some really cheap eBay stuff that we tend to use on all of our cars. And these were literally just left over, and we kind of, after we'd done some sort of back of the envelope math and compared a few different springs that we had lying around, we just ended up using these. They look cheaty because they're red, but really they're just they're essentially free. Okay. Wow. And that's what you want. One of the things that we're doing as we're building the Lemons Bitter up again is we're trying to parts Lego the suspension together. Now the original shocks are totally shot. It's none of this is really sort of rocket science or kind of esoteric parts. It's not a Citroen or anything like that. But we don't have we're not in Europe or in Australia where some of these parts are available. So what I have here is some Bilstein shocks. Now, this is the actual Opel or Bilstein shock for the Opels. And this is actually from my personal parts collection. It was pretty expensive. I had it brought to me from Germany in a suitcase by somebody. That was very nice. So we're not going to use this. This would be pretty cheaty to use, pretty expensive. Next to this, what I do have here is, this is an E30 Bilstein, which is used, and we got it for $100 the pair. So that was pretty cheap, and that's definitely what I would call Lemon's budget. And then what I have here next to it is the E30iX, so the all-wheel drive version. What you notice is that basically this one's too long, the E31, so we wouldn't be able to put the collar nut, the gland nut into it. So it wouldn't fit into the strut housing. The iX one is too short, and you could easily make that fit. Bring up to the same height by just putting some sort of spacer, like a piece of pipe or something down here. However, these are supposedly valved differently, so we're not going to use these. What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to make these E30 ones fit. And it turns out, this should work. They are a little different at the top, but I don't think that should matter too much. But what we do have to address is sort of the length. And what's interesting about Bilsteins is that they're actually a shock inside a shock, and they're upside down. And I'll demonstrate this here. I've taken the other one of our $100 Craigslist Bilsteins, and I've just with a little chisel punch, I've sort of chiseled the end cap loose. And what you can do then is you can pull out the shock, the actual inner tube, and Julian showed me this, and this is actually pretty cool. So what you can see is that on the inside, these are actually, they kind of look like regular shocks inside this tube upside down, right? So that's why they actually have an internal bump stock.
Bump stock? Aren't those illegal?
Yes. Very funny. This is California after all. Okay, so what we can do therefore is we can shorten. This is now just a dumb tube, which we can shorten down to the size that we need to make it this exact size, and then put it all back together, and then we should have Legoed our way into some bitter compatible shocks for on the cheap. So we're gonna do that.
Very cool.
Okay. Now that was easy. Let's have a look. This is X one. This is the bitter one. And this is the one that we just shortened. All right.
Moment of truth.
Look at that. Here's a view of the muffler that we're using. This is actually from a Nissan Z103X, and our teammate, who's quite the Datsun aficionado, actually surprisingly had nothing to do with it. I really wanted to preserve the stock look of the car, because so much else in this car is just stock, and I really didn't think that a side exhaust or something a little corny like that would really fit the look and the elegance of this car. So I really strive for making it look as stock as possible. And so what I did is I just simply measured how much space we had for the stock muffler, which was long gone ages ago, and you can't really get any of the OE parts anymore, and nothing really like that. And so what I did was I just measured the space, and then I went on various catalogs and punched in the different dimensions that we had, and I knew that I wanted a twin exhaust exit, and I was able to find something that approximated the downturns, and an inlet, one inlet. That's just because I was lazy and I just wanted to have one pipe coming down the back, and out came this Nissan 300ZX muffler, and so then it was just a matter of building some brackets to hang it to the stock mounts, and that turned out really well. I mentioned earlier that another thing that we like to do when we build a car is we just rebuild anything that deteriorates over time. And one of those things is definitely the fuel system. So what we did, one of the first things we did is we dropped this tank literally the day that the car arrived. And we sent it out to a radiator shop and had it boiled. It was really nasty inside, as you can imagine. And it was really just a miracle that it hadn't rusted through. And then we actually carefully rebuilt the sender unit that's in here that was completely rusty, and that was just a nightmare. But we were able to bring it back, fortunately, with some really careful sort of brushing and de-rusting and things like that. And then, of course, what we did is all of these fuel hoses are brand new, or at least they were when we first built the car last year. So these are all quality fuel injection lines. That every single piece, all the way going down to the engine. A new fuel filter. The pump was actually broken, so this is just, I think, off of an E30 or E28 or some other car that, again, of the era. It's all just Bosch parts that come into play here, and so that's just something that takes your mind off of any kind of fuel leaks, and that's something that the judges don't really want to see either. And then lastly, in the unlikely event that we might have a problem, we also have one of the nozzles of the fire suppression system routed here. So while you're out rebuilding your fuel system, boiling the tank, and replacing all the fuel lines, you might still want to get your motor going because you're kind of eager, right? And so were we. And we felt like this actually came up quite a lot, that you really want to eliminate, maybe sometimes also just eliminate some sources of problems, potential sources of problems for debugging, or you just you have a car that doesn't have a working fuel pump or something like that, or a fuel tank, and you really just need a source of fuel. A source of 12 volts is always easy to procure, but a source of fuel is a lot harder. And this is where this comes in. We kind of like took that opportunity to put this together, and this actually has come in handy quite a lot as we've rebuilt old cars' fuel tanks, which really has just been mostly bitters as of late. So this is what this is. This is a marine fuel tank or a fuel canister, really. I think this is meant for. I think normally there's a gauge in one of these, and I replaced it with another pickup, so that I could have basically a pickup and a return. And I think otherwise this is just for boats or something like that. How the hell this would be any kind of safe or secure in a boat, I don't know, but it works really great for us. So this is where the fuel goes in. Then we have a pickup here. It goes into another one of these Bosch fuel pumps that we just had lying on the shelf. Again, I think it's from an early E30 or E28 or E12 or something like that. And then this is where you'd hook up your engine or whatever, and then you can have your return go back into the tank here, and then you just hook this up to a power supply of sorts. Just any kind of, you can put a battery right here, you can hook it up to the car, and you have your fuel.
Yeah, ready? Okay?
Yeah.
Lastly, I think a few people deserve a special shout out for helping us get parts and procure parts. And I'll start with these two here, bitterparts.com and edelschmiede.com. Those two have teamed up in the past to actually reproduce some parts that Opel no longer made. I mentioned that Opel, unlike other German manufacturers, has not actually done very well with their classic car parts, keeping things in stock and reproducing them. And they have teamed up or individually made sure that things were produced for old Opels, and that includes, of course, bitters. So one of the things that they produced was this intake boot that was no longer available, and they, again, it's rubber, and after 30, 40 years, these things just fall apart, and having this was hugely beneficial because otherwise we would have had to make something totally custom here. And then the other thing that they did is they started making reproduction engine mounts, and we are actually using some of their products on this car as far as the engine mounts and this are concerned. They also have transmission mounts, which I can't show right now, and they really deserve a shout out in how they take care of the classic Opel and Bitter community. Then also some shout outs to other Hella Shitty team members for bringing things back from the holidays. We mentioned that we had gaskets and things like that for this motor in our suitcases ourselves. I actually brought back brake discs and all these other things because there's just nothing that interchanges. And then one of our other team members from Australia, he went home and he brought back these. As it turns out, Holden, another GM subsidiary that really doesn't exist any longer, unfortunately, just in name. They actually in the 70s took a similar car from Opel like this, the Opel Commodore, and they made it the Holden Commodore, which is now became its own car. But at the time when they did that, they actually used the same, almost the same front axle as the Senator, the Monza, the Commodore, and so a lot of the parts are the same. And so this is from the Australian aftermarket, because again, these things that we had in here, they were 30, 40 years old, they were totally shot. And so it's really nice to be able to get things that are absolutely not available from Opel anymore. And so in this case, we had to go to Australia all the way, or send one of our teammates to Australia. He was going anyway, but he was really nice enough to bring things back. Same for these suspension bushings. And so that was really nice. One other entity really deserves a lot of credit as well is the Bitter Club. They are located in Germany, but they really serve all Bitter owners and enthusiasts in all over the world. And they really have a ton of technical knowledge that without that, including, for instance, all of the workshop manuals and things like that you just wouldn't be able to find anywhere else except in the archives of the club. And without their help and sometimes also their ability to procure parts that are just otherwise impossible to find, we really couldn't have pulled this off. So thanks to them. Thank you for watching this video about the Bitter Lemon, and remember to subscribe our channel.